Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another In Conversation. And today I'm joined once more by a good friend to the channel, Jonathan Tye. And we're going to discuss an aspect of the Whitechapel murders, or an aspect of the Jack the Ripper case that doesn't get touched on that much. And it is the what was a big problem in the area, well, not just the area, in the whole of London at the time. And that is the problem of the local gangs. We might think we have a problem today, but they certainly had a problem back in 1888. So, Jonathan Tye, welcome, and shall we discuss the gangs of Whitechapel? Hello.
Yeah, hello, absolutely. It is a subject I've become more and more immersed with as I've looked at the murders, and there's wider aspects to the gang culture as well. There's a lot of parallels with how things are now in present society as well that you can draw upon when you look into the gang issue back in the 1880s.
Yeah, because I mean, one thing I've noticed from reading the accounts of in the newspapers of the gang problem, is it was almost like we have today. That you have postcode gangs, or well, district gangs at the time. So you had the Notting Hill gangs, you had the Lisson Grove gangs, you had the Tottenham Court Road gangs, and of course in 1888 there was a stabbing in Regent's Park, which was gang related.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at those sort of gangs. I think a lot of it is. I've tried to get some stats on the population structure at that time, but I imagine it was a young population, whereas today we have an aging population. So you've got a large number of youths in the population, and there's these groups that were formed based around locations. So you've quoted some of the gangs. I think there was one in Belgravia, the Fitzroy gang, the Black Gang, or the 40 Thieves, which were South London based or borough based. And in the area that we kind of look at, you've got this that they called it the Monkeys Parade of Youths in Bow Road, and I think the Pall Mall Gazette runs an article in October '88 during the actual murders about these gangs, and they incorrectly subscribe, I think, this monkeys parade gang to be in the terror of Whitechapel, but it's more Bow based, and it's very much about youth social disorder rather than crime in Whitechapel. And I think that's important to distinguish with these gangs. A lot of these are it's social disturbances by large groups of youth that can result in violence, like the incident in Regent's Park, this fight between gangs. I think that was the Fitzroy gang, but it's important to distinguish those type of gangs, and the trouble they could cause with the gangs that were running particular types of crime within the Tri-District, within St George's in the East, Whitechapel and Spitalfields, where you could have potential of a crossover with what occurred in the murders. So linking them more to the attack on Emma Smith, and the violence with gangs like the loosely called the Trippers Up. I think there's a slight you have to distinguish slightly between those different types of gangs that were occurring there, because there's far more of a sinister aspect to those gangs in how they were operating within the particular ingredients within that cauldron of East London. The docks, the sailors, the poverty, and the vice.
And do you think gang-wise as well? Do you think there was a nationality? Because obviously Whitechapel in particular, but London-wide as well. You had a lot of immigrants into the area. Do you think is there evidence to suggest that there were sort of nationality gangs as well?
I think absolutely, and I think what's fascinating about that period in the 1880s, particularly again in Whitechapel and the East End, you have a gradual change in terms of you had a previously dominated Irish gang culture that was gradually giving way to the Jewish migrations from the East, and the type of crime these gangs were involved with and how it evolved. You can see the seeds and beginnings of it with a lot of Irish gangs in the 1880s, that by the turn of the century and the sort of early noughties and 1920s was dominated by Jewish gangs. And with that, what I'm referring to is things like racetrack crime, and illegal betting, etc. and eventually vice as well become dominated by those groups. But in the 1880s, there was a sort of a rubbing together of these two different cultures and a gradual emergence. And again, what I've noticed in some press accounts, if you look in sort of you look up the stories from the 1870s and 1880s and the culprits that come up in some of these crimes, they've got all these wonderful sort of Irish names. Then you get to the 1890s, and then you start to see Jewish surnames from the East appear in the press, and then just happens in all societies. You see a mixture of both. So gangs operating together with people that obviously from a Jewish background and an Irish background operating in some of these so some of the sort of betting dens and illegal betting dens. You see a list of names of people arrested, and there's a mixture. So yeah, it's like a hotbed of a cauldron of change that's going on in the 1880s.
One of the biggest gangs of all, of course, was the the Metropolitan Police, who were out there trying to keep order amongst all this.
Yeah, yeah, and again, in terms of how we look at I know you see comments all the time on all the various Ripper social groups to understand how whether the police were corrupt at the time and the Metropolitan Police, or how the officers might have behaved and how that might have reflected on evidence given for the murders. It's a difficult one, but I think there must some of these police officers went, they had to walk down and act in streets where they were vastly outnumbered, and it was dangerous, and whether they often turned a blind eye or just did not want to get involved. I'm sure that was an issue with some, as well as corruption with others.
Yeah. I mean, I always remember there's a story, one of my favourite press stories I read about the police was Sergeant William Thick. And I think it was 1887. I can't remember if it was before or after the murders. But there's a press account of him walking down Commercial Street. And he spots someone who he knows is a housebreaker. And he's got a bag with him. So Reed walks up to him and grabs hold of him and says he's under arrest. He wants to know what's in the bag. And suddenly all these mates turn up and surround William Thick. I might have said Reed there, but I meant William Thick.
I know who you meant, yeah.
Yeah. And what Sergeant Thick does is he pulls out his truncheon, keeps hold of the guy, and starts battling off the others, and then gets the guy into a shop, locks the door, barricades, with he's got the gang, all these people outside, and then just waits for the constables to turn up and help him get the guy to Commercial Street Police Station. And he had indeed been housebreaking. But this is what the police were up against, isn't it? They had to keep order in an area that was, to the average person, a terrifying area.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, and interesting you mentioned Thick. There's an officer that actually retired from the police force in 1887. So he wasn't involved in the Ripper murders. An Inspector Marriott. And I kind of traced his life through. He lived in Nelson Street, which was the heart of a very tough district. And a lot of these police officers did live within the streets that they operated in. And there was an incident with him. I think he went out with his wife, and one of these gangs. I think in the press report, it says that sort of the 20 plus were intimidating people, and he interceded. They then turned on his wife, and he sort of had to fight his way out of the situation. And I think during his career, he'd lost teeth. He'd been attacked with an iron bar from trying to intercede in a burglary. So on a daily basis, they were very, very tough for these officers, and they had to get to know who the dangerous men were or gangs were in the area.
Yeah, and of course when we come, I mean, looking at the Whitechapel murders, as I think I said, as I said at the start, they don't. The gangs don't really get that much mention in accounts of the crimes. I mean, I very rarely see them get mentioned in documentaries on Jack the Ripper. If they are mentioned, it's misportraying the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee as being vigilantes as opposed to vigilance, and they come across as gangs.
Yeah,
Yeah, revolutionaries, and it's But of course,
Yeah, Mr.
gangs do
Lust being a
feature, certainly
revolutionary.
feature very early on in the investigation, because Emma Smith survives the attack and tells the police that she's been attacked. Well, she doesn't say a gang, does she? She says a group of three men, the youngest of which was aged about 19. But do you think that was a gang? I mean, does three men constitute a gang?
Yeah, and again, it goes down to definition and what I said at the beginning about your press had these large labels, but I don't see it that you were you were tattooed with that you're a part of X gang or Y gang. I think there are loose affiliations, probably with some family connections going back to the home country, to Ireland, or to the streets in where they lived. So I still think it could constitute a gang if there were 3 or 4 men that usually operated together, carrying out robberies or intimidation or garroting or intimidation and extortion from some of the unfortunates. Um, but we have to be loose with our definition of gang. I think it's more a group of men operating together that can come in and out of a relationship where they might, one day be operating together and another not, or independently. The perfect example, if you've looked at a character called Jeremiah McCarthy in St George's in the East, is a notorious operator from Pennington Street and Artichoke Hill that basically preyed upon the sailors with groups of women. So unfortunate women that we call unfortunates would lure these men in for a treat or a drink, either get them drunk or say, let's go back to X place, and then they will be robbed there, and often beaten and have their pockets ripped open. But I've traced many of the cases where at the back in the background is this Jeremiah McCarthy or a guy called John Sullivan or Maggie Sullivan, who was part of it as well. But the people involved can change, so you'll get different names each time, with a sort of might be a gang of 4 of them or 5 of them operating. So I imagine they're loose affiliations, but they're all carrying out the same method and coming together. And obviously, if they fall out, which often could happen over takings of what they'd stolen, fair distribution, or grassing up, that punishments could be handed out. I think I mentioned in the book a woman who had grassed up the brother of a gang that she knew, and she was stabbed in and threatened to be ripped up and stabbed in the abdomen. So these sort of terms, this is early 1880s as well. So those sort of punishment crimes are out there. But yes, going back to your original question, you could call the 3 men, and I don't think we should disbelieve Emma Smith, a gang of sorts. They work together to carry out that attack.
And then, of course, then we come to the next. Well, with Emma Smith, that's in a way it influences the early police investigation into what we now call the Jack the Ripper crimes, but which were the Whitechapel murders, because of course you get Martha Tabram, then you get Mary Nichols, and certainly up to Mary Nichols, they are looking. The police and the press and the local public seem to be convinced that the crimes are gang related.
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at this closely, even post the book, and I could be wrong in my assumption, but it seems to have the disconnection between it being a gang related or more than one person seems to occur when Abilene takes over the investigation with Nichols. It's he that asserts that this is a separate type of crime. Now, obviously, I believe that all the murders are linked. And I've pondered why he may have thought that, but is it a case that he arrived at the investigation and he's presented with a summary of these previous instances? So, well, Emma Smith, it was she before she died, she told us it was 3 men, one was 19. Tabram at the time, it was still this soldier thing floating in the air from Mary Ann Colony Purley Pole. So it has that he then looked at the Nichols murder, where there is no evidence at all of there being any other person. There's no sort of even background story of there being a disturbance that would have involved other people. So has it then been disconnected? And again, this is a personal opinion. There is a possible motive in terms of how that approach suddenly changed, because it's far better to say that this was a lone lunatic killer operating in the streets than to say that the police had lost control of the streets and that there were attacks occurring with gangs of people. And I don't know if Abilene took that stance, and I'm not disrespecting his view of the murders, but that's where the separation seemed to have occurred. And thereafter, and then suddenly we got Lever Apron becomes the object of everyone's building up this picture of this Jewish Lever Apron killer, and then eventually, of course, Jack the Ripper. I mean, but you're right up until that murder, there is a thought that it could be a gang, or they say a high rip gang, I think gets quoted, but that is based very much on the press in the northwest. Manchester and Liverpool did have an issue with those sort of gangs, and I don't know if they've sort of drawn them in. But even the Tabram attack and the Tabram murder, where the initial press reports, it was a silent night, there was no witnesses, we heard nothing, but by the end of the week after she died, the witnesses are coming forward saying there was a disturbance that night. There was noise coming from George Street. It was seen out of the rear window of George Yard coming closer, and the police admitted there were disturbances that night. So, it can't be dismissed entirely that there's been others involved. And going back to gangs, there was a notorious gang that operated, the Whites Row gang, that were based around Bucks Row, Bakers Row, what is now Valence Road. And it was spoken in the words of Robert Paul. There are such terrible gangs about. So, the perception of that witness was that I've got to be wary of this street because there are gangs about in this area.
Yeah, I mean that's what Robert Paul was fearful of when he walked down Bucks Row and he sees Charles Cross or Charles Lechmere standing in the road. He said later on, wasn't it, that his initial thought was few people like to go down there at that time because there are such fearful gangs about, and that's why he was wary of that particular incident.
Yeah, and as a historian looking back at those decisions Charles Cross and Robert Paul must have made in their journey, they had a very difficult choice to make at that time, leaving for work at that time of morning, because if they'd have carried on down and turned onto the main Whitechapel Road, there was also strong areas of intimidation there. You had unfortunates working outside and hanging around the hospital, and you had the related men that come with them, the bullies and the thugs that come alongside them. So I imagine if it was me going back that time, you'd be leaving for work thinking, what do I do? Do I go down there and face that there where I'm going to be harassed, possibly more, or do I take this side turning here, but I know things could happen here? It must have been very difficult for working men going through these areas. And you see it in some of the press letters, some of the people writing to say how intimidating it was walking through that area of Whitechapel.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, the gangs, even in Whitechapel, small pockets or quarters had their gangs. So you had the Old Nickel area, which was just up or carrying on Dorset Street, then off towards the right, going towards Shoreditch, was the Old Nickel. And that was quite notorious for quite a vicious gang. I think that was one of the areas, wasn't it, the police never dared really to go into on their own.
Yeah, we all know the stories about certain streets that police would not walk down on their own, or they'd have to go down mob-handed. And again, that reflects on how difficult the job of a beat officer must have been during that period. PC Neal walking his beat, what was he going to see around the next corner? He must have been very wary during that time.
Yeah. And of course, the one person who doesn't seem to have been afraid of them, although he did get assaulted by them, and but was equally they were terrified of him as well, was Frederick Charrington, who was going around the area trying to close the brothels down at the time, and coming face to face with the gangs, and often getting beaten up by them or getting attacked by them.
And that is such a great link to bring up, because there is I've been looking at it deeply. There is some kind of causal link between the sudden amount of gangs and bullies on the streets with those clearances. So a great example is Lady Lakes Grove, which became Adelina Grove, which is not far from the hospital, up towards Sydney Street. It was peppered with brothels, and nearly every house was brothel. It was a dangerous street to walk down. But the women would take men back to these brothels, and you'd probably have a very strong brothel keeper, whether that was male or female, that could police that brothel and keep the violence down. And suddenly these places are cleared, and these women are then operating on the Whitechapel Road. From where the assembly hall was. I think the assembly hall was destroyed in the Blitz, all the way down to the hospital. So their kind of custom was the haymakers that came in, as well as people coming out from the musicals. But these women are going onto the streets. The bullies are then able to intimidate and earn from them. And where the women were previously taking men back to brothels, they've got to take them down quiet side streets, like Bucks Row, like George Yard. So there is the moral aspect of the clearances, which was well founded, but it's what it did to many of those women, and the other aspect is an increased competition amongst those women for space and custom, to use an awful phrase about it. So when Polly Nichols, who was relatively new to the area, went walking eastwards down towards the hospital, those are some of the dangers that she was facing, and she was not an unfortunate or sex worker, to use that term, at the same level of some of these women that had long served St John's, Jack's Hole, and Nelson Street, and the houses in Lady Lakes Grove. These were women that were desperate, hungry, looking for their rent, and it was something they did as a last resort. They weren't experienced as some of these other women.
And of course, the thing about Mary Nichols, she's so associated with Whitechapel now, but she'd only been in the area for a matter of a few weeks. Was it July?
Yeah, and it's a common misconception. I think we see the films, don't we? I think, Annie Chapman, I think in one of the films in the 60s is played by Barbara Windsor. And you get this that they're all London Cockneys that know these streets well, and they're working the street regularly. But that's not what these unfortunates were. The victims were. Yes, Mary Kelly and Elizabeth Stride had a strong history with prostitution, but the others, it's something that we've got no evidence really for Catherine Eddowes, but the others, it was desperation and need and hunger, and their backstories took them to places far beyond Whitechapel and the East End. They come from different places, many of them.
Of course, one of the big things that we have to do as historians when we're looking back on this case is we have to read between the lines in what's being said at the inquests. Because, of course, if people like John McCarthy, who I'm convinced was operating, if not in the criminal underworld, was certainly on the periphery of it very, very much, the landlords in Dorset Street and other people, and the paramours of the victims, had they admitted at the inquest that they were living off immoral earnings, that would have left them open for prosecution.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I've always felt, and I state it strongly in the book, that Michael Kidney was living off the earnings of Elizabeth Stride. There's lots of telltale signs. The padlock and key was one of the traits of the bullies in the area, to keep them locked up when necessary, and that relationship, I'm sure, was operated in that way. I've always got a real soft spot for John Kelly and Catherine Eddowes. I kind of see them as a two lost souls who've come together, but I could be wrong about even that relationship.
Yeah, and going back to the area behind the London Hospital, at Sydney Street, because there was one part of that? Was it one very narrow alleyway that was famed for its brothels, and I can't remember if it was before or after the murders, but it did have the name Jack's Hole.
Yep, you've got it's St John's Place now, and it's I think now it's just sort of a few. You'd never guess its history. It's like a few, like a block that's almost lost its name, with a few sort of tower council blocks there. But Jack's Hole was absolutely notorious. And again, interestingly, and there is a that can link onto one of the murders. When they talked of the clearances in Jack's Hole, the press talked about the area being infested by bullies who wore red neckerchiefs or red handkerchiefs. Now, I don't know if that's some kind of gang symbolism, but what's always fascinated me is the witness statement of George Hutchison that talks about this red handkerchief brought out for Mary Kelly. And I don't know if there's some kind of symbolism there. It could be just a coincidence, but that these chaps that were dominating and bullying in that area, the gangs in that area, seem to have carried or wore red neckerchiefs or carried red handkerchiefs almost as a part of their affiliation to that particular gang or that area.
So they almost had their trademark.
Yeah, I think so, and when I read all the accounts, all the various accounts, they often mentioned handkerchiefs being produced, don't they? And the colours always interest me. You know, he produced a white. I saw that a gentleman wore had a white handkerchief or a white silk scarf. But there is something in that, and there is, of course, I think there was an association with with socialism and the match girl strikes, to the red colour there, obviously, but the early form of sort of socialism growing in the country. So it could be that aspect, but also it could be just a pure affiliation to a particular gang, or to let them know that these were bullies or looking after certain women in a certain area. But Jack's Hole would have been a terrifying place. Have you seen the Toby newspaper illustration of the women standing at the entrance of the court? If you look at the old Toby newspaper from the Toby is a fantastic paper for understanding the area. There's a picture of these three women standing, and it's got St John's Place, and they're in their sort of clothes. They talk. I know that that's an area that certainly a policeman would not have wanted to walk down until the clearances took place.
It's strange, isn't it? Because you're talking about what it is now, and I went down to try and film it. And I mean, I did film it, but it was modern. I mean, it was modern council areas, and and that's the thing, isn't it? When you look at these places and you think to yourself, "Oh, if only I could just get a glimpse of what it was like. Bring that back." And I suppose this is one of the interesting. I mean, I know people denigrate AI and they slag AI off something rotten, but I think in the future, I mean, perhaps not at the moment, but I think there could be a time when we can actually use AI to recreate those places. Give us an idea, a visual idea of what they were like.
I do think it will eventually happen. I was talking about this to someone the other day. I think the trouble is, at the moment, and it sounds really like very snobby to say this, I think some of the talented people that are creating the AI images are not people with great historical knowledge. So you're seeing these almost like like the old Pears soapbox images of Victorian women that are just not realistic. And if you look at any of these AI images that they run of sort of Dorset Street, look at the street layout itself. That the streets are like as if they were scrubbed clean. And I think we need to see more of a grim reality of what these places look like, and to look at old sketches and old black and white photos. If you go through the police drunkards record of women, it's from 1903 onwards, but you'll get a picture of an idea of what these women actually look like, rather than this model-like image that you get, especially of Mary Kelly, the very over-romanticised images of these women. But eventually, I do feel exactly what you said. We hopefully we'll be able to put a hat on or goggles on and walk down the streets, and that'd be marvelous to see them as they were. It'd be fascinating.
Yeah. We'd probably all walk into each other, though. There'd be so many people doing it. all colliding. Where are you going to? I'm going down to Jack's Hole today, and I think maybe I'll leave Jack's Hole at that. But no, it's as I say, I think AI as I say, it does get slack. I think the problem with AI, of course, you've hit the nail on the head there, because it's how you instruct it. And the problem is that the people who are instructing it at the moment are not the people who know who know how to, or really know what it was like, know the history of it. So they can't really recreate it. I think I saw one the other day. There's a lot coming out this Christmas where they're showing a walk through London, Christmas 1860 or 1856, and they're putting stores in that weren't even open in the 1850s. And I think they've got stores that were over in Oxford Street are turning up at the end of Regent Street, and and it does look good. It looks cartoonish, but I think it's in its infancy at the moment, and I think the time is going to come when we'll be able to recreate those areas and take people into them, show them the horror of the gang. Because I mean, these gang members must have been terrifying.
Yeah, and these individuals have been in some fights and some major bust ups that often involve knives as well. So even some of the women would have been scarred and roughed up individuals. So you wouldn't particularly like facing them in the dark or even in the daylight, to be honest with you.
And of course, there weren't that many of them, but they weren't as prolific as the male gangs. But I've done a few articles about the female gangs of Whitechapel, and I've completely forgotten her name now. But there's a notorious female gang leader who was always robbing. I mean, it's mostly robbery that they were involved in, robbing men on the street or luring men into some of the alleyways and then robbing them.
Yeah, I mean these tripper up gangs in St George in the East are notorious, and it's an example of as well. And I sort of discussed this in a presentation at the East End conference. It's an example of women actually taking advantage of the foolishness of men, and they're not victims in that situation. They lure these sailors who have been well paid, who have naively come to shore to have a good time, and they're lured off to the typical thing you read in the press is they ask them for a treat. Could you treat me? And these women would take them off again to a public house, sometimes in cahoots with the public house, sometimes not, and then they'd say, if you'd like to come back and stay with me in X place, and they go off to one of these sort of brothel houses in just off the highway, or around the Sailors' Home in particular, Wells Street, that sort of area, and then they would be robbed. They'd have their pockets cut, and they'd have their bag rifled. And I've seen examples where their medals were stolen or where their whole wages were stolen. And they would run off. There's one poor sailor that's mentioned in one press case that was followed by Mary Sullivan, who's connected to these trippers gang. She was with 6 or 7 other women, and this sailor knew what was going to happen, and he was refusing. He didn't want to treat them. He didn't want to go off with them, and he ended up having to hide in a local shop until he was rescued by a policeman. So these women could be just as intimidating as well, but ultimately behind a lot of these women gangs, there were men, there were bullies like Jeremiah McCarthy, like Edward Buckley.
Yeah. And of course, with Thomas Sadler, who was the sailor with Frances Coles on the last few nights of her life. I mean, one of the reasons he was fuming was because he'd actually been he'd been mugged by one of the gangs.
Yeah, and apparently she warned him not to go down the street. I'm still 50-50 whether she was actually involved in that. Because that's a typical way of behaviour with some of these women, that they would take go out for a day, get him drunk, have a good time with him, and then lead them off to an ambush. And it's possible that she was involved. It's possible that it's not, that she wasn't involved, but he turned on her because he believed that she was, or she didn't help him enough. But it's possible that she was involved in that sort of operation. But many of the women that were soliciting or operating in down by the highway or down in St George's in the East would have been used to that kind of practice, where men were ultimately robbed and stolen from, and no transaction in terms of sort of a sexual transaction actually ever took place, or never was going to, because the women always intended to rob them and then get away.
Yeah, because there were, I mean, I've read several accounts of men after the onset of the Jack the Ripper murders who go with women into alleyways or go into sort of dark courtyards, uh, obviously thinking they're going to get one thing, and then the women suddenly turn on them and say, "Look, if you don't if you don't let me walk away with the money, I'm going to start screaming Jack the Ripper," and that happened a few times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, there's a fantastic scene in Murder by Decree, isn't there? Where I don't know the actress is. She takes Dr. Watson off into an alleyway to apparently to tell him more about Mary Kelly, and she calls out, and her bully turns up and says, "What you doing with my missus?" That's so typical of that kind of style of robbery that was portrayed in that film, where the man appears and said, "What are you doing with my woman? I want money." You know. So yes, that was operating all the time. There's a I've got so many stories that I've put in the book. There's a Texan like a businessman that goes into this that's taken by this woman to a brothel at 5 Devonshire Street. And when he goes in there, he goes up and starts to undress to get ready to go into bed. Obviously, he's been enticed there, and then suddenly the gas is blown out, and he's bundled by not only the woman but loads of men, and everything is stolen from him. So he's left to try and find a policeman and to get rescued, literally with nothing on, no property, where he's been stolen. This was happening all the time. We talked about streets to visit. If we do get AI, mine would be Devonshire Street, which is gone from the face of the map. It doesn't exist because of Watney Market. But that was there was poor lighting there. There was no street lighting at one end, and nearly every place was connected to crime or a brothel. And then Stride has an association with that street. So does Edward Buckley. But number 5 in particular, Devonshire Street, was notorious for not only vice but crime, for harbouring men that had carried out robberies and having women go back that then robbed men.
So that brings me to I suppose really an important question is: do you think Jack the Ripper could have been a member of one of the gangs?
My opinion is that in order to navigate those streets, in order in to have been able to go off with those women, you needed someone that was familiar with the police beats, that was not wary of the area at that hour, and was local. And I believe that someone that had operated either in a gang or loosely in a gang was responsible for those murders. Whether or not that's Edward Buckley or someone like him, I do feel that's the case. And I don't think there's a contradiction with that than the psychological analyst that we have of a serial killer, because there's no reason to think that someone from that background could not have had those issues that led him to carrying out the crime, the murders, or the post death sort of violation within the women in that way. So this is why I believe that there is a connection between the Emma Smith murder going through Tabram to Polly Nichols, and Tabram is the bridge between the two murders. So whoever was a part of that first attack on Smith and the Tabram murder, I believe, was the perpetrator, whether alone or with others, of Polly Nichols. I don't believe that by saying that you believe it was someone that it was a gang, that all the murders took place with a gang. You could have, it's an individual that was part of it and then was prepared to kill alone and confident enough to kill alone. So that's my view. It's about navigation and walking those streets at that time of night. You know, that this top-hatted gentleman view, stalking the streets. It's just not the reality of what that area was like at the time. You would have need to have been familiar with the area. It's possible that the women were loosely familiar with the killer, not on personal terms, but loosely familiar. The person was a face they knew or they'd seen before.
And do you think if if he wasn't a member of a gang, but the gangs knew who he was, do you think the gangs might have taken care of him? because obviously the murders did attract a lot of attention to the area. And it must have made it very difficult with the extra police, the extra press, the amateur detectives, the vigilance committees. It must have made it very difficult for the gangs and the criminals of the area to operate.
That's a really good question, because you think that if this person was discovered by the gangs, they would have wanted to finish him, end him, or put a stop to it because of the attention the area was getting. But I don't think it's one I could answer. I think it's such a hard one to think about. But it's a good question. But whether or not,
Do you think there's any possibility that Jack the Ripper ended up buried under one of the houses in Whitechapel?
it's such a difficult issue to ponder, why this intense period of activity of murders just trailed off, and stopped. I personally believe that Mackenzie was a Ripper attack, or a Whitechapel murder, part of the sequence. But thereafter, why is a difficult question. Was it a period?
Yeah. And this is Alice Mackenzie, who's murdered in July 1889.
Yeah, I think that it bears all the hallmarks in terms of location. I don't think it's a copycat. I think the only thing that makes it, you've got the idea that there's a gradual escalation in the murders that culminate in the terrible atrocity of Mary Kelly. It does drop off because it's outside. It's back outside, but it's just where it occurs. It's off that main axis of the Whitechapel Road leading, where you've got Commercial Street going north, Commercial Road leading off to the south east. If you look at any map, George Yard, Castle Alley, and then further on you've got obviously Mitre Square. They're all these turnings just off that main thoroughfare. It to me, it screams of being the same hand.
I'm inclined to sort of agree with you on that one, but as I say, going back to sort of what happened to Jack the Ripper, one of the fascinating things that I've done quite a lot of work on in videos and in writing is, as the slum clearances get underway. I say get underway. The slum clearances were already underway when the Jack the Ripper murder started. The Goulston Street block of apartment block where they found the graffito, that was a slum clearance, had been built in 1886. So, and large chunks of Flower and Dean Street had been demolished in 1888. So the slum clearances were well and truly underway by the time. But as you start going through the slum clearances, they start unearthing skeletons underneath buildings. There's a case in, I think it was 1892, where they were digging in Flower and Dean Street. They were for some new houses, and the workmen found several skeletons, and it became quite a thing. I think they ended up. I can't remember if they were trying to sell teeth or something as well in the local pubs. I've got a vague memory of, but it happened then. It happened in the early 20th century on Whitechapel Road. They are finding skeletons, and who's to know? Maybe one of those skeletons was Jack the Ripper.
Absolutely, and there's a story in the press before 1888 of one of these guys that went in and did the jobs of the slum clearances, and it's sort of a day in the life of, and he talks about this, not only finding bodies, but the graffiti was quite a common thing. I think he found in a cellar on a wall. I can't remember the exact wording, but I've gone now, but I will be back when my knife is sharpened. And this is just before the autumn of terror, So yeah, there is stories of these guys clearing these places and finding knives and bones, etc. as well. So yeah, Whitechapel had its secrets, didn't it? It really did, going back.
Well, exactly, yeah. And I think this is the thing, because I think one of the problems we have today is because of the Jack the Ripper murders, the focus tends to be on Jack the Ripper. So I think a lot of people don't realise that Whitechapel was a violent, dangerous area. I often hear it said that murder wasn't common in the district, but murder was common in the district. Not that sort of murder, but there were murders in the district, and attempted murder was massively common in the district.
yeah, you've got massive sort of issues with domestic crime that was constantly reported in the papers. There is also uh, the 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 children going missing is another big thing. Child abduction, or young girls in particular just disappearing off the streets. Um, and yeah, there were attacks and murders as well, and there were those that were often put down loosely to being as a result, I think, of drink or exposure that could have been as a result of violence. We see those stories as well in the press. So yes, a dangerous and violent area.
Do you think the gangs were involved in the child abduction? I mean, there's the famous cases, isn't there, of the vanishing girls of West Ham, where several girls just disappeared off the streets and were never heard from again. I think one of them, Amelia Jeffs, I think it was, yeah, Amelia Jeffs. Her body was found in the attic of one of the new houses that had been built in the district. But aside from that, I think it was two others had disappeared. And then there's another one I did a video about a girl whose body was mailed in a box from a post office on Cambridge Road, or Cambridge Heath Road, as it now is. And it was found in, they couldn't deliver the box. So they took it back to the depot in Goswell Road. And they noticed a strange smell coming from it and opened it. And they found that it was the body of a girl inside it. She was never identified. Do you think the gangs might have had an involvement in that, in the child abduction? Or
I think, I mean, for the next book I'm writing. I'm looking at the sort of the underworld of vice in the area, and from what I'm sort of finding is that a lot of these girls that are disappeared or taken, there's usually like a procurer or a procuress behind it. So they're kind of seduced away initially, and there is, throughout the press in the 1880s, there's lots of talk about this trafficking Belgian and French girls into the East End, and the traffic of girls from the East End out towards France. Of course, we've got the Kelly story of going to France for a while, and Belgium, and in kind of exchange. But often these girls are they're more, they're kind of not seduced into a role, but they're misled into a role. They're offered positions in service. They might come from out of London and travel down. Or the young girls that you see that disappear on the streets, how they were taken, I don't know, but they're sort of taken off to these brothels and then kind of ruined, if that makes sense. There's a young girl called Elizabeth J, who's local. She's a sort of 15-year-old that gets taken to a place in Lady Lakes Grove by a sailor who's in his late 40s. But the story in the press, and you said about reading between the lines, the story in the press is almost like she's innocently sitting on the steps of Whitechapel Church and naively goes off to this brothel in Lady Lakes Grove, to go with this older sailor or cook. I can't remember what he is. But when you read the story and you read the follow-up stories, it's clearly that she's in cahoots with the woman who runs the brothel at Lady Lakes Grove. So she's being controlled, and she's a young 15-year-old girl, by an older woman that's had a similar life story, but she's now kind of elevated herself to running girls herself. Um, and so I think it's some of these women criminals that are behind a lot of that kind of disappearing of girls, or the taking of girls into brothels, or then trafficking them, but so they kind of disappear off the face of the earth.
And I think that's so important. I think one of the things that we, with this focus just on Jack the Ripper and who Jack the Ripper was, we lose so much of the social history of the time. But the social history was massively important. And I think one of the points about the violence in Whitechapel as well, I've got this theory, and again, it's a pure theory, that had the murders happened in any other part of the country, in any other, really any other time, but mostly in any other part of the country, they probably wouldn't have had the impact that they did with the media, because for years people had been focusing on Whitechapel. Whitechapel wasn't, probably not one of the worst parts of the country, but for some reason it became the focus of everything that was bad in society. And so when the murders started happening in the area, I think that was just everyone saying, "See, I told you it was a bad area." And it almost became like a self-fulfilling prophecy that Jack the Ripper had struck in that area.
Yeah, it's all, and I think maybe possibly because it's right on the doorstep of the centre of this empire that we had. So you've got the wealth and the richness of the West End. You've got government based in Westminster, and at their doorstep, just over over the city boundary, you've got this vast, lawless, dangerous area that like you say, was just focused on rather than other than high above other areas of crime across the rest of the country. And I think didn't it become a bit of an object of fascination? You get these guys slumming it, or men and women slumming it and going down and touring the area to see what it was like. So it almost become one vast sort of like a, I don't know, museum for people to look at the terrible thing that life that was there.
Well, of course, Tumblety famously was a slummer who went to look at the slums of the East End. Uh, so I think, and of course, the other thing, of course, is that you've got the philanthropy is going into the area as well, and I think a lot of a lot of what the publicity that it got was because the philanthropists saw it as an opportunity to start highlighting the horrific conditions in the area. Uh, one person who does surprise me didn't make more of it, or at least I've not really come across many accounts of him making more of it. Was Frederick Charrington, who we've mentioned already. I mean, Charrington was around at the time, but
Yeah,
he doesn't tend to mention it that much. I did a video quite recently about it was about a journalist from the Methodist Times who was gathering information on the conditions in the area, and he managed to get himself arrested twice for being Jack the Ripper. But on one occasion, his very first arrest, he's followed by a group of men or a local gang. I think it's down Commercial Street or it's up Whitechapel High Street. But they start saying, "Oh, do you know Frederick Charrington? He's not right in his head, is he? We think Frederick Charrington's the killer." And he said how preposterous it was.
I've seen an article where some of the women in some of the local pubs, the unfortunate, were saying it's him. He's the killer because of what he's done to us girls. He hates us girls. It's him. And I was really taken by that because it's a real example of a almost early celebrity uh, suspect, because coming from the actual mouths of the women themselves.
But he doesn't seem to. I mean, I could be completely wrong about this, but as far as I can see, he didn't really make that much comment on the killings. Bernardo, who was also in the area, Thomas Bernardo, he did, but I could be wrong. But I don't think Charrington really involved himself that much in the hunt for the killer.
No, I don't think I've not read anything. I think I've read the book of there's like a 1912 book of his life and his work in the East End, but I didn't come across anything there. I think the other reformer of Mary Steer that opened up the Hope organisations, the Bridge of Hope organisations. I think there's some commentary from her and a good insight. If anyone wants to read about the area. Down towards the highway where we started our mission. That's an insightful look into what it was like for these women and the dangers that was there.
Jonathan, this is such I just think this is such a fascinating part of the case.
Absolutely.
And this is one of the things about the Whitechapel murders or the Jack the Ripper crimes is, you don't have to be that interested in serial killers or the gruesomeness of it, but it's just the window it opens up that we can look in through, and then actually peer into this part of London
Yeah.
as it was and see all the good, all the bad that was in that area at the time. So I just think it's fascinating. But one thing I will say, which I always like to end my videos with this now, is it's something that people should go back to the sources themselves. I think people shouldn't rely on commentators as such. I mean, obviously buy books, which I would never say, but also go back to the sources. Don't just trust what people say. Question everything. Go back to the sources. That's my mantra for 2026.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's nothing like building your own opinion on reading the actual sources themselves, and then you can equip yourself to be able to discuss the case or the area or the history. But it's far better to actually go back right to the source of the information itself.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, I'm looking forward to you were saying that your book's probably going to, you told me earlier that the book's going to be coming out not next year, but the year after next. So it'll be 2027, won't it? This is about the gangs and of the area.
Yeah, the new one would certainly not be this year. It'll be in next year. I'm still sort of very much researching. I'm looking forward to it coming out when it does.
But of course, your book on Edward Buckley is out now.
It is.
You can get it on Amazon as well, can you?
Yeah, Amazon. You can order it through Waterstones. So it's out there. So there is a lot of information about the streets and the crime and the gangs in the area, as well as Edward Buckley and how this all sort of mashes together with the murders themselves.
Fantastic. Well, Jonathan, I'd just like to say thank you very much for joining me, and have a great remainder of your day.
Great. And you really enjoyed it. Thank you.